Hello and welcome everyone to our webinar today. It's all about the data, resetting board perspective on data, an important topic quite commonly discussed in the boardroom. Looking forward to having Susan Noiles speak a little bit in more detail on this today. A few reminders as we get kicked off. Purpose of today is to share trending and knowledge on how multiple aspects of data should be an important focus for all boards of directors. If you have questions, please write your questions in the Q&A section. Our goal is always to answer all questions at the close of the presentation. Otherwise, we'll follow up with you via email afterwards. Regarding the materials, both the video and the presentation, yes, the entire webinar is being recorded. You'll receive a link via email shortly. This link will also include the ability to view and download the presentation deck in its own separate file. For those of you joining with your IBDC.D certification, you'll receive 1 CPE credit by attending today's webinar. Just be sure to follow proper CPE credit submission guidelines. And with that, let me do my introduction of Susan. So Susan, great to have you with us today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Mark.
Great. Let me give the audience some of your background here. So you are a non-executive director, CIO, and transformation expert. You're a lead at Noiles Consulting Services, an independent board and executive advisory firm focused on technology and transformation, with emphasis on improving performance and aligning technology risk and human capital. Great. You are a pioneer of strategic data governance at the board model and method, and you're an experienced executive coach and advisor. And I'm happy to say you also have completed your IBDC and have your designation. Congratulations. Good for you, Susan. Glad to have you with us today. Great. Quickly, for me, I'm a governance and strategy expert, Mark Pfister, non-executive director and chief board consultant. My book, Across the Board, has reached circulation now in over 70 countries. And I'm also the proud creator of the International Board Director Competency Designation. We'll talk a little bit more about that at the end of today's webinar. Susan, let's get right to the main event, as I typically say here. So interested to hear what you have to say. And there's been some buzz about this topic. Take it away. It's all yours.
Thank you, Mark. And thank you all for joining me here today for resetting board perspective on data. I have 2 themes for you. First of all, a focus on data as an asset in today's economy. And second of all, an introduction to a framework that enables board level governance of data assets. And to do that, we're going to, first of all, spend a little time on background. Then we're going to focus on data from a board perspective. We'll move to the strategic data governance framework itself, and then spend a little time on how to implement that framework. So without further ado, as they say, let's move on to the background. Now, a typical default definition for the word data involves, in everybody's mind, involves digital data, when in fact the scope is much broader than that. And board directors need a broader frame of mind so that we don't miss risks and opportunities. And what's digitally encoded is actually a small subset of human knowledge. And the current assumption is that that knowledge can be digitized or will be so via tools such as AI. And do you have, as a board director, a sense of how much how much data is in a non-digital format and how valuable that a resource that might be? Because data is information, it is knowledge for your organizations that organizations in this era need to run successfully. So when I ask the question, is everything data? I'm actively mining for your reaction. And I'm asking you to evaluate that reaction in yourselves, to challenge the preconceived definition, to better understand the strategic opportunities and risks. And between the human and the digital ends of the range sit paper and other media that hold information. And then there's IP and processes that are knowledge that can be converted into digital code. And digital code itself is in some way, shape, or form data. And when you think about the flesh computer that is the human brain, what is human in us can train systems, can inform systems, can design systems. And data is gathered constantly from humans via social media and other means and methods. So human capital is a very important piece of this puzzle when we usually think about it as purely a technology type of topic, because it's the humans that drive the development of new IP and processes, the creativity and the insight that moves us forward, despite what people think is happening with AI these days. So now we're in the current era of digitization of technology, but it's really about the sophisticated management of knowledge and information. And technology that we're so narrowly focused on, so hyped about, actually can't work without its data partner. It's useless without the data. And not so long ago, we were talking about the data age, data as the new oil, the rise of a new economy. That new economy exists now. And the data age is active as businesses rely on effectively deploying knowledge and information with technology as a tool. So I encourage you to think beyond the bounds of in a digital format in a production database as a board director. So why does this matter? We need data for manufacturing, for inventory, for service, for research, for everything. And there is a supply chain that's associated with this data. And all verticals are dependent. Most humans are dependent. And even humans who are living in a jungle in South America are dependent on data being used to protect them. So in this day and age, it's absolutely critical in our world, in our economy, to run organizations using data. Can you run one without digitally encoded data? On paper, you can do the job. It's going to be expensive, slower, but you have something. If you only have code and hardware, you have a very expensive nothing. So that's kind of the value balance of data versus technology. And the long view perspective on this is that your dependence on data is a material exposure for the companies on whose boards we sit on and advise. And the gatekeepers in the data space present a strategic risk as business dependence on digital data grows. Now, many of these gatekeepers masquerade as technology players, and they give away free tech in trade for getting data. So Meta bought WhatsApp as an example. They bought WhatsApp for the business side of WhatsApp, which provides insights and metrics. And that's founded on data collected from over 2 billion individuals. So if we move to the saying, if the product you're using is free, then you're the product, which you may have heard before. I'm asking you to push beyond that a little bit and think about that it's actually the data that you generate that is the goal. That's what's leveraged, turned around, and access to free tech is given to you in trade. So data is the knowledge, information you do business with. It is the true asset. And technology is the machine. It's the repeatable logic and a means for collecting and using your data. So even if we think about the simplest business model, such as a kid's lemonade stand, when you think about the supply chain of everything that goes into that, you understand just how complex it's become in today's world. So the glasses, the water, the cooling, the lemons, all of those are dependent on data to move them and create them. So how does this all apply to the board? Before I move to data as an asset itself, I want to talk about some realized risk examples. The first one I'm going to give you was an entire industry provided data to a third-party service provider who used that data, sold it back to the industry and sold it elsewhere without the industry's knowledge or approval and with no contractual limitations. That's a contractual and values alignment issue. It is not a technology issue. And many of you are likely familiar with the recent Move It situation. There were many companies that were exposed not because of what they were doing in-house, they were fine in-house, but they were reliant on third-party partners to process their data. And it was those third-party partners that had the exposure. And so the vulnerability was not something that was in the scope for many boards and wasn't up on their radar screen. You may be familiar with Unity Software. Their shares dropped by 37%. They lost $110 million, which was directly attributable to data quality issues that impacted their machine learning. That data came from a large customer. So it's a clear example of the risks of dependence on that supply chain of data. And I suspect the board at Unity Software never saw this coming. I had a client in financial services in South America. They had an employee whose family was held hostage to force this employee to extract information and bring it to them and to move money, which essentially is data. So people are a channel through which data moves. And I've actually had somebody in the C-suite sit down and show me private and confidential information, trying to show off. That's a values alignment issue. It's not the technology that's done something bad. I've had clients where they haven't had the budget to move forward strategically because they've had to go back and do rework on complex, fairly recent systems because they needed to comply with regulatory and data reporting changes. The problem was not the technology. The technology ran the way it was built. The problem was in the lack of foresight and the lack of design for positioning around the potentials that were going to happen in this policy and regulatory environment. There are a number of exposures associated with paper media. I think we're all familiar with that in the media. Espionage is not only cyber-based, industrial espionage exists. Sorry about that. And information walks out the door on two legs via third parties. So now data exists on a global scale. The data economy is on the global scale. And we're in the early stages of identifying characteristics, economic principles, and the very, very early stages of regulation. And it's changing business behaviors and valuation drivers. And the Gartner definition I give here for infonomics is pretty broadly referenced. I would like to draw your attention to the word liabilities at the end of the definition. As with any asset, it comes with pros and cons. Gartner also notes that there's a disparity in the value of the data assets and how they're treated by accounting practices that have not managed to keep pace. And this results in markets valuing off-balance sheet information assets. As board directors, that should give us some pause. We should think about that and understand that. And the University of Cambridge study that I reference here was done from a public policy perspective. It's about creating public good. The concepts in the study are broadly applicable. They actually identify economic characteristics for data. But what I want to point out is that this overlap in the think tank and consulting space on work being done to define and codify the economics of data directly impact the economic and government policy and regulation environment in which you do business as an individual and as a representative on a board of directors. And when it comes to value of the data asset, the Gartner research gives us just a sense of the kind of impact that might be possible. There are other analyses that show that data-rich organizations trade at a premium. But just because you're not in the business of data itself doesn't mean that data doesn't have value as an asset for your organization. And if you're a not-for-profit, what we're talking about here is maybe not a dollar value, but it may be service value. Drive efficiency, maximize the value of services. It may support your fundraising efforts. And PwC has defined value drivers within the context of a standardized categorized view of strategies for leveraging data. And they've got valuation methodology approaches that depend on the characteristics of the data being valued. There are many, many other methods and approaches around, so I'm not suggesting the PwC one is the right one. I've just used them as an example. And when we as board directors think about this evolving space and the gap in the standardized accounting methods, it means that the board needs to continuously educate itself and to provide the correct guidance to the organization regarding this very valuable but potentially risky asset. And on a side note, Emergent is data valuation as a service. It's going to be interesting to see how this evolves, particularly when there are no standardized approaches to the valuation itself. In the M&A space, data is often overlooked or treated superficially. If you're entertaining offers, you risk missing value and the opportunity in the corporate data assets. There's also a risk, there's a downside if the data isn't as good as you think it is, or if there's liabilities associated with it that are going to be discovered during the process of acquisition. If you're evaluating an acquisition, what are you really buying? Why are you interested? Because, for example, if you're buying the customer base, that is instantiated these days in the form of data. So do you, as a board director, have viable, decisionable information regarding that asset? And the board needs to be informed at the same level as it would with any other asset. So tech telling you that it's going to cost you X amount of dollars and there's this many records is not sufficient anymore when you have this kind of critical dependence on the data. Which leads us to a fundamental question. Is the discovery team capable? And are they constructed appropriately? And is the maturity of the target's operational and strategic governance environment also at a level that's going to give you a certain amount of confidence in what you're looking at? Now, digital topics consuming huge amounts of bandwidth at the board table. There's a vast amount of money being spent. Traction can be elusive, but underlying all of these technology topics is the use of data. How do we get data? How do we use it? And for what end? And how do we protect it in the case of cyber? Now, I'm not suggesting that data governance is the magic bullet for what ails all of these initiatives, but it's potentially contributory. And data is the content that's needed to deliver business value. And it gets short shrift as we get very excited about the technology tools themselves. So I recommend focusing on the use of the data at some level, appropriate for a board, how it will be used, and the value that that brings in order to create a more balanced perspective. And if you do not have the data to support these technology platforms, they will not deliver. And to effectively extract that from the investment, the content, the data needs to be part of the equation, not an afterthought. And so a data strategy is an important component. And regrettably, they quite often devolve into a technology strategy, and they have to be about more than that. They have to be about the data content and what is going to be done with it and the value that that brings to the business. So how does this all relate to board mandates? I've summarized that in this slide, but it directly impacts you and I as board directors and advisors. It lands smack dab in the wheelhouse, and it's an absolutely critical asset to manage effectively in this economy. Now, the conclusions we can reach. That boards who elevate data as an asset and begin the process of strategic governance are positioning themselves for success in the economy. And beginning this process enables opportunities, risk mitigation, scenario planning, and contributes towards the vitality of the organization in the future. And organizations and boards who understand how dependent their success is on current and future access to data are better positioning for that future, better positioning the long view for that policy environment that's evolving, that defines data ownership and valuation, for ensuring that the data supply lines are appropriately defended or pursued. And while I have no easy button for you on this is the definition of data that you should use, the board's ability to define and govern data is directly linked to the values, vision, and mission of the organization. So this is something that has to be customized and constructed by every board. And the board needs to regularly challenge that definition and ensure it still makes sense within the evolving context of infonomics and of the organization itself as it changes and matures. And when we think about the technology hype that's consuming so much of our mental bandwidth, we need to remind ourselves that it's really about managing knowledge and information. And that without the data, the technology is useless. The two must go hand in hand. So let's move to the strategic data governance framework itself. The model places data in the center of spectrum of interrelated and codependent domains. And a domain cannot be healthy unless all the other domains are healthy. And you'll see why as we walk through this. The first few domain definitions are pretty self-explanatory, but I'm going to give you some sample questions to give you a sense of why they matter. So values. Does how we treat the data asset reflect the values that we believe in? Do the data assets factor into our strategic decisioning in the vision category? And in the mission domain, does the company know what it has and have the data assets to perform exceptionally well? Channels are the rails on which your data moves. That's where it's consumed, purchased, utilized to produce value. That's where the rubber hits the road. And regulatory and legal are called out as a separate domain because they are so critical. This is the economic policy space, the regulatory environment that governs data, and the exposures and opportunities in contractual partnerships and service offerings. So within the model, we differentiate between operational data governance and strategic data governance. Operational data governance is the tactical day-to-day governance of the data asset within the organization and is the management's responsibility. Often, if it's in place, it's misconstrued as strategic, and it rarely suffices for board-level governance. The model is framed to align the domains to the organization's strategies and goals, to reflect the contribution of data to the formulation and the achievement of these. And now we all know that the values, vision, and mission come before strategies and goals, but here we're talking about the subset of those as it applies to data. And the gray boxes are the intersection where under domains where governance and execution intersect. And there's been no attempt to define right or wrong and say this is tactical and this is board level, because boards operate at different levels. But these are the conversation topics that are so vital to have between the committees and boards and the senior management team and the board. Now, channels are about more than the technology that moves it. So does the board have sufficient perspective and information to govern these? And let me give you an example of applying that framework, a large transformative project. And if you look at the regulatory and legal domain, are regulatory and legal experts actively involved day to day in the initiative? What I've seen repeatedly is they're at the beginning and they're at the end of a transformation, but they're not at the table on an ongoing basis, nor do they have the capacity or the skill set to do that necessarily. Are company values reflected? How does the board know that? Where does the data come from? Is it what's needed? Is this going to be sufficient for success the way the board defines the success that's desired out of this transformation? So the assurance that these questions are being asked and answered, even if it's not the board directly asking them, is vital for the board director. And I recommend that briefings cover the entire spectrum of domains for a holistic, integrated understanding. And use the framework as guidance for content that should be considered. Not everything in the gray boxes is going to apply all the time, but the question should be asked, does this apply? And that will support a less siloed view of the topic at hand. Additional key levers for boards are enterprise risk, obviously, always critical. It needs to span the entire spectrum of domains. If it's just focused on basic compliance and then data as a technology subtopic, there's a lot of exposures that we saw in that previous slide. So ERM and the CRO or the equivalent function need to align to the board on this topic. Policies, practices, and controls that reflect, align, and create the desired behavior when it comes to data, vital, obviously. And then last but not least, human capital and capacity as the very important foundation for this. Does the organization have the human capability within the board, within the committees, and within the organization to do this effectively? And this is not, do we have data analysts, but it's really about melding the framework domains with the mindset, the experience, and the ability to tackle accountabilities with the right perspective and contribution. It is the cultural and skill ecosystem. The model lays out stages of maturity to help guide assessment and gap resolution. And the stage of maturity that you're targeting is based on your data dependence. And there are indicators, there's much more detail behind this, indicators that provide standards for determining your current level. So for example, if you had unclear committee mandates or lack of operational data governance, you're probably functioning at a level 1. I feel level 2 or 3 is very necessary in today's environment. And even if you think data is a minor non-critical aspect of your business, there's still the need to remain educated, aware, and to begin the journey. And regulated or confidential data is probably not covered by a level 2 well enough. So level 3 is appropriate for most organizations today. Level 4 is the domain of companies that sell or buy data or are data analytics services. These are the companies that not only lead in the infonomics space, in other words, they make money off of data, but they also invest heavily in influencing economic and regulatory policy development via lobbying and think tanks, etc. And so if you come to the conclusion that data or analysis of data is actually what your business is about, then level 4 is not optional. You need to be at the table influencing policy at a level of investment that's appropriate for your business. So how do you implement this framework? The framework establishes as many do, the continuous learning and improvement cycle that also gives you an implementation approach. First step is education, alignment, ensuring that there's agreement on the board's mandate when it comes to this asset. The adoption of a consistent framework and a maturity level target that can be adjusted as you learn and as you grow. Working with the committees to define mandates and interrelationships. A discovery and assessment exercise to address key questions and make sure that the information vital to the exercise of governance is available to the board. All of this is going to change, value statements, board policies, metrics, create all kinds of needed change so that there's a step in here that allows for identification of the greatest risks and opportunities in order to prioritize that work. All of this should generate a cultural shift within the board and within the organization as the data asset is elevated and is treated within the overarching business ecosystem. Expectations and standards should change, and that will inform your next cycle of improvement. And I do strongly recommend that boards have a regular data governance discussion cadence in their calendar. So these are initial questions for the board. They're a starting point. May not be able to answer them all right away, might need some deeper dives. I will note that peeling the onion on the stewardship versus ownership of data definition is eye-opening. Many organizations have this, but they haven't actually digested it and translated it into the way they behave, the values they believe in. There's a disconnect. And when there's a conversation with the appropriately informed regulatory and legal experts at the table, the understanding about how tightly this integrates with values, vision, mission starts to become apparent. And it's very, very important. I will note for you that the market hasn't tackled this effectively. If we think back to that off-book asset valuation conversation earlier on and the regulatory policy posture, there's still a disconnect there around ownership and the rights to do certain things. So remain cognizant that this is a risk. Now, the fabric that enables the effective execution of this framework is really in the committees, as with many things at the board. The relationships between committees are not one-to-one with the framework, but the crossovers are actually very informative regarding where committees need to work together. On the operational data governance side, which committee has got accountability for that is vital. And does the board receive the appropriate information from that committee? And does that committee have the correct capability in order to actually oversee that operational data governance function. And the challenge for the committee will be to determine, is operational data governance mature enough for the organization? And they need from the board that definition of data and the maturity target aspiration in order to do that effectively. And I will note that often, if operational data governance is in place, it is seen as a tick the box bureaucratic exercise, which links us right back to the values and culture aspect of this. So the board needs to understand, how well operational data governance is in place, if it is there, and there are a whole series of other questions that can be asked. Now, we'll note, some people ask me, why is steering listed? Steering committees are typically very focused on change or execution, and that's where the rubber hits the road with the data asset. So where all of the domains come together. So very, very vital that steering committees are included in this picture. Now, each domain has as a subset a series of questions to support discovery and assessment. I'm not going to go through them today, but just wanted you to be aware that they do exist. And what I hope you take away from the webinar today is, first of all, the need to elevate data as an asset and to be educated and remain educated. The usefulness of a change in perspective around what data is and the issues with too narrow a digital definition. How important data is for strategy, risk management, and human capital decisions, and vice versa. How a framework can assist you to govern a vital asset and make sure that the impacts on the organization are positive and that the strategic opportunities inherent in data are taken advantage of. The need for the balance between technology and data, the better perspective on where the value exists in that equation, and how important it is to embed data as an asset discipline within the board and within the organization itself in the data age. And please don't forget about that very simple business model called the lemonade stand. So thank you so much for your time and attention today. If I can answer any questions or be of any assistance to you on this topic, my contact information is included in this presentation. Once again, thank you, and over to you, Mark.
Susan, really nice job. A lot for directors to think about here as it relates to data correlated to the governance and the strategic aspects. Very nice. Appreciate it. Let's go to questions that came in that were asked to be read here. So the first one is, agreed that data is an asset, but many organizations seem to be collecting personal info and using it for profit. Is there a risk side to data in your model that should be considered for reputational and ethical purposes?
Right. So when you look at the domains, the values domain does talk about ethics. Obviously, the enterprise risk management component of the framework needs to incorporate the risks associated with having private and confidential information. I've highlighted, I believe, several times that the board needs to continue to remain cognizant of the disconnect between the regulatory policy on data privacy and ownership versus what is actually being done and what the market is valuing. There is a massive disconnect there, and that should be up on everybody's radar screen on a pretty regular basis.
Great. Who on the board or what committee should own the governance component of data, and is this a critical committee? This question came in before you got to slide 22, but maybe a little further discussion on this is warranted.
Okay. Yeah, I think every organization has different labels on their committees, different mandates for the committees. Typically, my default would be to put this with a committee that has asset responsibilities, right? And to start there, the question for the board is going to be, does that committee have the correct competencies on it? And maybe there's a need to change some of those competencies and add people or enhance the membership of that committee in order to cover what is quite often a topic that has some technology spin on it in some other spins as we see in the domain, just to make sure that that entire framework is covered off.
Great point. All right, let's do one more question here.
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting. It sounds basic to start with, but maybe it's deeper in the question. Do you view data as a separate category than AI? How should the board think of this?
I do view data as a separate category of AI because what AI does is it consumes and learns from data. Um, and so it is incredibly dependent and intermeshed with that. But my fear would be that if data is just seen as a subcomponent of AI, we're back to what I've been kind of preaching against, which is don't subsume data under the technology. It impacts everything that an organization does in this day and age, whether it's on paper or whether it's digital. And therefore, I believe it deserves its own focus and its own treatment.
Understood. Great answer. Susan, thank you so much for your time. I'm sure this webinar was well received and will be from a recording standpoint as well. Great information, great framework. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you all for your time and attention.